Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Train the Mind by NeuroSmart podcast, where we will discuss effective tools and techniques that prepare the mind for optimal performance under stress. My name is Melissa Balban. I'm the founder and CEO of NeuroSmart, where we develop mental resilience training designed for law enforcement and military officers and professional athletes. Today, I'm very excited to have Carlos Gonzalez as our guest. Carlos Gonzalez is the founder, owner, and CEO of Blue Theory LLC, a military veteran and also a second-generation law enforcement officer that served 30 years for the Miami-Dade Police Department. He recently retired as the Director of Training and Research, where he researched, created, developed, and personally instructed numerous courses for local and federal agencies, the United States military, international police and military, and other agencies located within South Florida. He has been responsible for the development, coordination, and implementation of all facets of training for tens of thousands of law enforcement personnel. In addition to thousands of hours of training and providing instruction, Carlos holds advanced certifications from the Force Science Institute, Critical Incident Review, and the Association of Force Investigators, and is currently one of the 2 people in the world to hold all 3 certifications. He has been expertly trained in areas that include psychomotor skills, cognitive interviewing techniques, officer and suspect behaviors in assaults on police, motor performance, visual attention, memory, stress and trauma effect on memory, effect of low light levels of perception, causes of in-custody deaths, prevention, recognition, and interpretation of contextual cues, dynamics of action versus reaction in force encounters, decision-making variables during critical incidents, and judgment and psychophysiological responses under extreme stress. Using this knowledge, Carlos created a force analysis and training development unit, which focused on using empirical data related to human factors to provide an objective assessment on incidents involving use of force, and using the data from this assessment to not only ensure systemic issues were not stemming from policy or training, but also design training geared to engineering resilience within the decision-making process and condition officers to perform at a higher level. This evolved into an entire training methodology known as the Blue Theory. In addition, Carlos has created a court-recognized methodology and assessment protocol that is utilized to review use of force incidents. This model, IPAAM, has been used to analyze thousands of police use of force cases, taught to various law enforcement entities, community groups, community relations boards, independent review panels, and state attorneys' shooting investigations teams. It has been adopted by the Association of Force Investigators for their advanced human factors and police training course. Welcome, Carlos.
Thank you, ma'am. I know that was a mouthful. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, and I look forward to the conversation.
Me too. We're very happy. I'm very happy to finally arrange this call with you. I know Carlos and I have had a collaboration when he was at Miami-Dade, and we'll talk about that a little bit. We're looking at the recruit's performance under stress. But yeah, let's get right into it. So you recently retired from your role as a director of Miami-Dade Public Safety Training Institute. And during your tenure, I know you instituted quite a few changes at the police academy, particularly in the way that scenarios are run. Let's go back to the beginning and talk about what led you to design these changes. What problems did you encounter when you first started?
Absolutely. So I'm going to go just before I ended up being the director of training. Prior to that time frame, I was the discipline coordinator for my department. And I was responsible, for handling all mitigation, arbitration hearings, anything discipline or corrective behavior associated with anything that happened with a police officer. And in that process, I started to see trends occur where officers across the county were being, were making the same violations of policy, and they didn't know each other. They weren't trained the same way or at the same time. And I'm like, okay, it's one thing to associate a mistake with human error, and it's another thing to associate or understand that mistake can be really influenced by the system that surrounds the officer. So we took a look at the policies and the training associated with those events, and we're like, okay, here's the problem. We fixed it, and all of a sudden, no more violations in regards to those specific issues. Okay, so the director of the department at the time asked me to do the same thing with departmental training, and that's where I ended up getting the job. We were seeing a myriad. Our police academies are roughly 45 to 50 people, trainees, and when they would graduate the academy, we would see a very high percentage of individuals being rephased in field training. the specific training that happens while they're on the road with field training officers. And it was very high. We're talking about out of 45 people, 43 would get rephased. And obviously 90 something percentile, that obviously that's not very effective, and it's not conducive to a very productive department if we're constantly having to reevaluate, redo, rephase, reassess, and retrain. So I'm like, okay, let's find out why these things are happening. And we looked at our police academy specifically. Our police academy is 6 months long, and it's regulated by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. It's a curriculum that they send to us. We got to go by it, and that's the standard for our state. But it didn't go over any of the things that we thought were causing issues or could lead to issues in the future. So we had an extension of several months after the police academy, which is more administrative in nature, associated with my department or my former department. And we decided to remodel or redo that extension and focus on a specific, what I call a macro cognitive training program, where we run a series of phases, an evolution, so to speak, from zero all the way through fruition to enhance officers' decision-making, enhance their capabilities and their conditioning associated with different events and motor skills. And we were very successful in doing so.
Yes, wonderful. Yes, I personally actually had the opportunity to visit and see firsthand the effects of this training, which is very impressive, and I want to talk more about it. Now, before we get into the details, you say that the standard training that's mandated by the state of Florida does not go into the issues that you were seeing in the recruits when they graduated. Can you talk a little bit about what kind of issues are these? The human errors or decision-making mistakes? What kind of issues that weren't being addressed by the standard training?
Well, so as you can imagine, it's just like when you look at standard operating procedure, right? SOPs are written for standard operations, and not much in law enforcement is standardized. Every time you go through a call, every time you have to handle a specific situation, they're so complex that there's no book or series of books or rules that's going to be able to govern and dictate everything that you have to do or can do on a particular call. Well, the curriculum is based on generalities. So when they talk about de-escalation, they give a definition of de-escalation, and they provide, a handful of examples, which obviously is incredibly limited, and it doesn't necessarily teach recognition of a specific event, how to resolve that event, what resources you need for a specific event. Doesn't have any of those things, and that ranges anything from traffic stops to handling a person in crisis, to anything that an officer would get into on a day-to-day basis.
Right. So it sounds like, and we talk about this a lot in this podcast, that the standard training wasn't really teaching the core skills that is necessary for officers to make good decisions. Instead, it was teaching a procedure. So it was more of a procedure-based training rather than a skill-based training.
Yes, ma'am. The training it's almost like a university style block and silo, or you do 2 weeks of legal, take a legal test, 2 weeks of defensive tactics, take a defensive tactics test, and you go through every chapter, every unit, and then at the end they give a cumulative test where everything is tested, but it's written. And you probably know significantly more than I do in this, but just on the research I've done in regards to education and learning, they're only getting about 10 to 15% retention from these type of block and silo formats. So it's not very conducive to long-term effectiveness.
No, yeah. That's really impressive. So that you started a new additional training that you call phase 2, right? And it's 3 months long. Is that
It's a little over 3 months long. It really depends on holiday schedule, but it's somewhere between 3.5 months long.
Okay. And yeah, so tell us about this extra months. How do you structure them? How do you test the competencies?
Okay, so we have to remember that the people in this particular program are people who are in the academy, they're trainees. They have limited training, if any. I mean, most people who come to the academy have never even held a gun before, right? So we're starting from scratch. And what we did is we utilized the force analysis unit, the data and the information that our research and force analysis gave us, and we basically used that to engineer this particular program that I'm going to talk about now. And I took from military performance, I took from sports performance, I took from aviation and nursing. I dabbled in everything because there's nothing specifically written for law enforcement, and we came up with this particular process. So I'll go over it briefly, and then you can stop me and ask me where you want to emphasize or speak more about. So we start the process almost day one with what we call unstructured play, right? So there's a lot of literature associated with unstructured play with children, and as opposed, letting them play with that box or do whatever they want to do to use their imagination and figure out problem solving and everything associated with unstructured play. And obviously there's no literature specific to law enforcement on that, but I'm like, these kids are coming in with limited problem solving capabilities, especially the younger generation, in my opinion, which is not a hit on them. It's just, that's just kind of the way that things have worked out. Let's see what they're capable of, and let's let them roam freely without any stress and absorb the good that they're doing, and some of the things that are not too shabby, and then take a look at the bad and then utilize that to assist them. So we'll make them do traffic stops, we'll make them do a building search, we'll make them do a myriad of other exercises, encounter or engage in dealing with a person in crisis, depending on levels of crisis. And we'll see what they do with no training whatsoever, right? And what happens is, on a rare occasion, you'll see a shining star. You'll be like, oh, wow, that's a great job. Like they're doing things that are outside of the box, maybe not within police practice, but incredibly effective. And we're like, all right, kudos to you, great job. The majority of the time, what we see is what I call the cell phone effect. And I use this comparison for them because it's easy for them to relate. Most people have, smartphones, and smartphones are artificial intelligence that are patterned off of human intelligence. So when there's too many applications open in the background of your cell phone, the application you're trying to use doesn't work very well. It starts to freeze, it starts to slow down, or it just shuts off completely. So you have to go in the background and swipe up so nothing is pulling away from your attentional resources or from the phone's attentional resources. So same concept. When they start freezing in this unstructured play, we'll debrief them and say, hey, listen, what happened there? Oh, I didn't know what to do. This was what I was focused on, but I didn't know what was going on over here. There was so many variables hitting them. They didn't know which one to prioritize and what direction to go and what resources to utilize. So we would annotate that information and get the overall, arc of information with the entire class and utilize that to move forward. So we knew exactly how to teach each class and go personally with each individual in what they lacked and, made them better, as opposed to just teaching as a whole, knowing that some people won't be able to catch up or that everybody's thinking of things in a different manner. So that unstructured play.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. That unstructured play, basically, it's when you take a test and you get number 17 wrong in a test and you're really frustrated about it because you knew you got number 17 wrong. You walk outside and they ask you, and you ask somebody, hey, what was the answer to number 17? You can regurgitate, you can repeat that question by memory because it frustrates you because it was a negative to you. But when they ask you what was the number 18, or what was the answer to number 18, you have no recollection of what 18 was. For me, that's just, again, you can probably speak more to this, but that just shows me that people have a tendency to reflect on the negative significantly more than they reflect on the positive. So the unstructured play shows them where their negatives are. So when we actually start teaching the process, they know exactly when to focus in on and what to pay attention to fix that mistake. And we've seen that be very successful.
That's really fascinating. I mean, two questions I have about this. One is it actually, and we talked with Jesse Curtis here in this podcast recently, and we talked about the power of pre-test. Actually, I think it's a similar idea here. He was talking about multiple choice testing, like the actual written test, and they would start with a pre-test before any training, and found that actually there's literature supporting this idea of having a test before learning to kind of see where you are, to get motivated. And it puts, yeah, I mean, they don't like being wrong. They don't like not doing it.
Correct.
Was that your experience as well? So my first point is, I think this is a reflection of the science of learning, which I'm not an expert at all, but we will provide some resources in the comments here. The power of pre-testing before learning to increase learning outcomes, both in scenario training and also in written exams. But what was their reaction to the pretest when I think I was there also when you did this, right? The first week, and they didn't seem like they were enjoying it that much, in my opinion. But I want to hear about, from you, how do they take it being put on the spot like that?
You're 100% correct. They don't. It's not a joyful event, right? You're being placed under stress, and you're being, to them, we're just watching. We're not testing them because we're expecting failure, right? We're expecting mistakes, but they want to prove themselves.
Yes.
So when they don't perform at the level where they believe they should be performing, they're upset about it, right?
That's
So
very powerful. Yeah.
right, the beginning of the methodology, the unstructured play, um, they do it obviously because it's kind of part of the task.
Mhm.
There's not a lot of joy associated with it, but when they do come back later on, and they'll tell us, man, that unstructured play was so significant in why I was able to learn this when you guys taught this, because I
Yeah.
remembered specifically what I did wrong, and
Yeah.
when you guys taught it, I immediately absorbed it.
Yeah.
So on another point, which you're 100% accurate on, and so was your other guest, the pre-testing we do only because we're limited in resources and time for in-service training. So we have enhanced in-service training also, as opposed to running them out and doing unstructured play. We do pre-testing, and almost all of them get, I don't know, 70 to 80% of the questions wrong specific to what they're asking that day. And they're embarrassed about it because these are tenured,
Right.
police officers, they're cops, and it doesn't land right with them. So when we actually put them through the training, they not only they put more enthusiasm in because they don't want to go through that embarrassment,
Yes.
but they also retain more. So it's very valuable.
Yeah, very valuable to do pre-tests. Okay. So the other thing I want to, before we move on, kind of I think it's kind of crazy that these officers are certified, like they already finished the academy, right? So they can go on the street and act as cops.
By state standard, yes.
By state standard.
Yeah.
Okay. So what do you think about that? I mean, just given that it seems like they're not doing well on the first day of training of this extra phase that you implemented. I mean, what does that show on the state standard? But
Well, I don't want to I don't want to talk bad about the state standard. Right. It's there for a reason, and every state has a different standard, which is a problem in and of itself. But I think there's a way to do things, and there's a thorough process, and that we should be taking in order to get our officers or our trainees trained to the point where they can meet expectations. And then there's effective way of doing things. And I think state standard is the way to do it effectively. And I say that almost like in a negative connotation because, okay, what do we need to cover? We need to cover legal, we need to cover driving, we need to cover shooting, we need to cover this. What's the fastest way we can do it with covering everything? Bam, 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 bam. So it's effective from that concept or using that mindset, but it's not effective for getting them conditioned to the point of meeting expectations. The process isn't very thorough. They didn't think about that specifically. So take into consideration resources, money allocation, all of those things are a hindrance for any police department. So the more you put in it, the more expenditure you have. Not every department has the ability to do that. So
right. Okay. But let's
you want me to continue with the methodology, or do you want to?
Yes, let's move on with methodology. You did the pretest, you did the unstructured play, and everybody feels embarrassed. What's next? And I mean, when we did this, I just want to add here, we did a pilot study when Chief was in Miami-Dade, and what we looked at was stress levels of these recruits coming into phase 2, at the beginning of phase 2 and end of phase 2. And so I had a chance to observe, and so it probably added even more embarrassment or difficulty for the recruits that. But anyway, I think from a stress perspective too, I can tell that they weren't quite ready to maybe be on the street at that.
Correct.
So let's continue to the next step.
All right. So next step for us is what I call the mental preparation or variable recognition phase. In law enforcement, in military, they use the term situational awareness a lot, right?
Yes.
But situational awareness is subjective, at least in my opinion. Most people, when you ask them, and I've asked every class, and I've taught hundreds of classes, what situational awareness is, and the normal response is being aware of your surroundings or being aware of the situation. They just use the actual term to define the term. So they have very little context in regards to what it actually is. And in my research, the best way that I can assist in situational awareness or understanding situational awareness was to understand variable recognition, right? And like some people, Gary Klein, for example, they go into pattern recognition. Well, and they utilize that for the military. We can talk about that in a second. But the variable recognition even breaks it down a little bit further. I'll give you a reason why I talk about that. A domestic dispute for a dispatch domestic dispute for an officer, they can get there and not hear any noise, knock on the door, open the door. The husband and wife did have a spat. The neighbor called it in, but they're fine. They're having dinner. Everything works out, right? That very same call, the next time they get, I mean, with the same dispatch information, the same priming information, that very next call, when they get there, there could be a woman or a man screaming for help. There could be blood on the threshold and the door busted in. There could be the house is ransacked. Every one of those variables is not only different resources that you have to utilize, it's a different decision-making process that you have to go through. So we can't just go with an overall, hey, this is how you handle domestic disputes.
Domestic violence, yeah.
We have to break down each variable and then have them learn each variable and what that variable will spin off to. And then when they get to the end of it, they'll be much more equipped to understand everything that goes on. So that mental preparation process we use, and I did take a lot from Dr. Gary Klein, decision recognition prime decision models. They were used in the military probably several decades ago, and they're continued being used now by different military and law enforcement entities through Dr. Klein. And he has different ways to do so. His pretext was, if you go with every situation, like if this happens, then what? This happens, then what? Or what if, then what do you do? What if, what do you do? And you keep asking those questions until you have finished the scenario, right? What we did is we developed a recognition model for what we thought, what the research showed us, was the 4 calls that you had a higher likelihood to be involved in a use of force or an officer injury, which were in the United States, a traffic stop, a building search, handling a person in crisis, and a domestic dispute. So we created recognition models, basic recognition models for all 4. And we teach, and it's only on a mental preparation side, cognitive preparation, we teach those models at a basic level to each trainee over a series of several weeks. And as we go, we start adding a variable. And then we go through that entire variable in that format. And the trainees write down the recognition model for that specific variable. Then we'll add another one, and we'll continue adding variables until the scene is incredibly complex and there's a lot of things going on. And we take each one of those recognition prime decision models from them, format it correctly, work out some of the little kinks and fine tune everything, and we provide it back to the trainees so they have it as almost like a playbook, which I took from sports performance, the benefits of having a playbook to study, to learn different things associated with not only variable recognition, but with different schemas. So they keep that, and they're allowed to keep that and utilize that consistently, and they're always allowed to add different variables and formulate new recognition models, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So half the day is utilized doing that, and then the other half of the day we do the next step, which is motor skills development. So building searches are, not many people are dexterous or have incredible athleticism. So holding a gun while you're thinking about something and working your way into into a hallway where you have to zigzag into rooms and button hook into a certain entry point. Not everybody can do that fluidly, and most people are going to be concerned about their feet, and all their focus of attention is going to be internal as opposed to focusing on what's outside. So as opposed to putting them in that situation, we just created different, I don't want to say complexes, areas where we coned out certain movements. So not only did we practice the simple drawing of a firearm, unholstering a firearm and holstering it, where we talked about extension, compression, pressing up against your vest or your chest, button hook entries, pendulum swings, all these different things that are associated specifically with motor skills. We would practice those over and over and over again. It's kind of like when you're taking your child to their baseball practice for the first time and they've never had a glove on, and you don't expect them to go out there and play second base. You got to put that glove on. They're going to put them in a little crouch position. I don't want to crouch because then I'll leave off the camera. And they put their glove out, and you almost have to roll the the ball into their glove, and then they do the little alligator thing on, or they sandwich it in. It's kind of it's repeating those steps over and over and over again throughout the entire academy, the second part of the academy, until those things have been conditioned to the point of automaticity or really, really close, right? So they don't have to utilize any attentional resources on that when they have to go into an evolution. So
that's really interesting. So basically the idea here is to automate the process as much as we can on the motor side.
yes.
So they can save the attentional resources to decision making essentially, and recognizing those that's yeah, I mean it's been my experience too. I mean I saw this very briefly, but on multiple occasions about putting handcuffs on someone was quite stressful for a lot of the officers in training based on what we were monitoring. And I also saw that a lot of times the training was run such that the trainer would just say, they would just say, I would now arrest the guy, but they would just say it without doing it. And then that's the end of the scenario. And but actually doing it actually takes away so much resources that in the scenarios that they did do it, they did have to do it. There usually was like a bad thing happened right after because they didn't know, because they were so stressed, they were so, their attention was gone basically to that little thing and they couldn't carry on. So I think it's so important to practice those skills. I think that's the right approach to separately and put them in the muscle memory as much as you can so that you can continue with the other stuff. Okay, yeah, so I just wanted to say that makes sense from a neuroscience perspective as well. So one question I had about, so you said you teach the model and you add variables. Can you run through one example of how you do that with one scenario, let's say a domestic dispute? What's the initial scenario and what model, and then how do you add variables? Like and in what time frame is this taught?
So the easiest way, the most relatable way, probably the most relatable way for your audience to understand is through traffic stops, because not everybody has been in a domestic dispute, but most people have been stopped by the police know what that means, right? So let's use that as an example. Well, a standard traffic stop, first, one driver, know their occupants in the daytime, no tinted windows, no weather conditions, no hazardous road conditions or traffic conditions, plenty of shoulder on the road. Like that is the most basic traffic stop we can give you, right? That's what we start off with, right? Then we add a second passenger on the front passenger seat. I'm sorry. Then we'll add multiple passengers in the back. Then we'll do tinted windows. Then we'll add a higher vehicle where you don't have access to see through the rear windshield, or you don't have the same access to see on the side mirrors. loud music, non-compliance, rain, every one of those things, being light, dark outside. We'll practice traffic stops at nighttime so they understand the variables associated with that. At nighttime, when you use your spotlight or your takedowns, which is the headlights or the overhead bar that flashes forward, you can silhouette yourself. And you can, basically, if you turn around, you can also be blinded by the lights. All those things are different variables that you can utilize or that we should be paying attention to. And technology is progressing in such a way where now there are some vehicles and some manufacturers that are making key fobs that give orders to the spotlight and give orders to the takedowns and the lights, where you can actually walk up to the car and turn them on after the fact. And all of those things are adding a different variable into your thing, making announcements of having the driver step out of the car, depending on the circumstances. Like, every one of those things is a different example of a variable, right? Now, those are fairly simplistic in our world, but each one of those variables, if you handle them incorrectly in the real world, they could result in a bad outcome, in an unwanted outcome. So we try to work the way through that and show them what the result would be. So if something happens where, we introduce firearms, we introduce weapons, we introduce contraband, all of those things are different variables you have to take into consideration. So I know I went backwards there. But if you don't handle that correctly, we basically stop the scenario, and we explain it to them. Hey, listen, why didn't you do this? What should have been here? Blah 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 blah. So they recognize when their mistake happened, how it happened, what you're supposed to take into consideration, and what to do the next time. We do that because before we used to finish the entire scenario and then critique, and we found that they wouldn't know which one of the issues they had to prioritize, and they would remember one, maybe two, and then forget about the other things, and those mistakes would occur again. So we just started stopping the exercise right at that point, fixing it right at that point, taking it back about 30 seconds, having them move forward from there. And if they can make, an error in the next part or whatever the case may be, we would have them fix that, stop, fix it, and go back and forth that way.
Yeah.
There's a myriad of different examples, but those are things we take into consideration.
That's really helpful. So basically they run the same scenario multiple times, but each time with a different set of variables. Is that right?
Yes. Well, we want them to learn each variable to the point where they recognize it, right? So we're not going to, if they run a car that has 4 people in it, it's completely tinted windows, you can't see inside, and the driver is uncooperative, and they run it once and they're unsuccessful, that's not the end. We want them to run that until they understand how to deal with that specific variable. So some of the easier variables, the less complex variables, once, maybe twice through the evolution, it's an easy thing to grasp. As it becomes more complex when we move through the process, we do multiple, basically walkthroughs of the evolution.
And at the end of the scenario, do you debrief them, or how does the debrief look like?
So what we've done is we debrief at every point, every decision point, or every time they make an error, we debrief or brief in regards to that and move forward. And then we've separated the class into groups of 6 to 8. So as 2 people are performing, 6 people are watching. And there's an assessor, which, let's say it's me, looking at everything and stopping them whenever. And there's another assessor or instructor inside the group of 6, and their job is to get information from that group of 6. So the group of 6 would say, this is what we would do. And then they would watch the trainee do it. And then if they saw something wrong, we wanted to exclaim, hey, that is wrong, but not to the trainee who's doing it, to the actual instructor within their group while they're watching. So they're picking up information and understanding the variables and understanding how to resolve it at the same time, even without going through that walkthrough themselves.
Yes, and I'm sure there's a lot of learning just by watching as well. What about the trainees that are actually doing it? What happens to them? That is there any point where they're not stopped and they go through the whole scenario? I know the ones that I watched were like that. That's why I'm asking. Like, at some point you have them run through the entire scenario, even if they're doing mistakes, right?
Correct.
And then you debrief them.
That is correct. That is towards the latter half of the training. So after we finish the walkthroughs and they get an understanding of each event, and we go through that slow pace, we do put them through some high fidelity exercises where there are decision making points, or we call trigger points, where every time you make a poor decision, the scenario escalates, and then you recognize, okay, that was not the thing to do. But at that point, once you reach those high fidelity exercises, we allow you that, and the finishing exercise, we allow you to finish the entire thing.
Right.
Because that's where you're being evaluated at that point. That's the very end of the exercise or the evolution.
Right. Have you thought, or what? So I like the immediate feedback aspect when to really, to associate your actions with that feedback and to make correction. But there, I can also see a downside where you can, if you're basically not giving the officer the chance to recognize they made a mistake and correct it themselves. Which in real life, I'm sure that nothing will be perfect and they'll make sometimes mistakes. How do you think about that? Like, have you what are your thoughts on I can see pluses and minuses of both approaches to scenario, where one is like you just run them, they make a bunch of mistakes. At the end, you just kind of talk to them about them, but it doesn't really register because they already done it, and that's not the brain work. So that's the negative of that. But then when you interfere every single time, that's not giving them room to self-correct. How does your approach work to teach them also to recognize their own mistakes, maybe in the moment or maybe in a few seconds later?
Okay, that's a very good point. Luckily for us, when they make these mistakes, they shut down. Like, they have no idea what to do next, and they start looking like deer in the headlights, and they kind of gravitate towards us, like, I think I just messed up. And even if you gave them an opportunity, and we're like, okay, what would you do next? They're stuck, right? So for us, it's pretty easy to determine whether or not they're going to be able to work through that problem. If they look like, okay, they're going to self-correct, we'll let them. But a good portion of the time, because of the state that it's in, we know they're done. They're stuck.
You're stuck. Okay. That's interesting. So when I visited the academy, that was one of the things that was very different from other academies or places that I've been, is the debrief portion, which was very stressful for the trainees. It was particularly stressful, and I can see why, because you are basically making them think through all these decision points, which is something that they should learn, and not just telling them essentially what's the right thing to do. So that's interesting. I think that they were just kind of, now it makes sense to me now that we have this conversation, because on the outside it didn't look that stressful, but now knowing they were going through all those steps that they should have done, or this in the evaluation phase, that explains the stress they were experiencing.
Yeah.
All right. So they go through this, and then they go through an evaluation at the end of 3 months. Is that like a pass or fail? Is there a failing chance here, or everybody eventually graduates? So what's the outcome of this training?
So, at this point, we've invested, roughly 10 months into these trainees. So there is failure, and we have, almost every class has one or two people who probably from stress or nerves don't make it through the evolution. But what we do is we offer them remedial. And if they take it, we keep them for an additional 2 to 3 weeks and work on their deficiencies. And then once we go through that entire process, we have them take the finishing exercise again. And if they pass it, they're allowed to go on the road to their field training. If they don't, then we dismiss them, and they are no longer allowed to be part of our department, or my former department.
All right. Thank you. So just to wrap up the training portion, and we'll get to this last 5 minutes, I want to talk a little bit about just challenges in training in general. But before we go there, I want to ask, so what's your take on the results of this program? How long did you run this? For how many years? And how do you what are the results? How did you evaluate it? Like you mentioned in the beginning, there was 43 or 43 out of 45 people in the class would be rephrased. Did you look at numbers like
Yes.
that to see, how that impacted this rate?
So we did. There's several ways that I tried to get objective information, but it's difficult because you don't know exactly where the performance is stemmed from or where the outcomes are stemmed from.
Yes.
But so what we saw was with the policies we had in place at the time when we started, it was going for 5 years, and my tenure there, the program went for 5 years. At the beginning of that, my department was averaging, just to give you some context, we have slightly over 3,000 officers in my department. We handle way over in the excess of 1.5 to 1.8 million calls for service a year, and somewhere between 24 or 25,000 arrests on an average on a yearly basis, right? So we were averaging somewhere in the 350 to 400 uses of force a year, and higher, mid double digits in regards to police officer shootings, right? And that ranged from 20 something and all the way up to 30 something, maybe 40, depending on the year, where police involved shootings. And we had that high level of rephasing in FTO. Well, as we started to go through it, once we started the program, we didn't have more than 5 or 6 rephases at all in FTO for the remainder of the period. So 4 of the 5 years, that we never rephased more than 4 or 5 people. Let's say 5 is the average, comparatively to 43 or 28, which was the next class. I think that's what we were able to accomplish. And from a use of force perspective, we went from the 350 to 400 range. And the year that I left, we had 160 uses of force with the same numbers, 24,000, 25,000 arrests, 1.8 million calls for service, and 8 shootings, which is down significantly from where we were at before. And there's a lot of details. We changed policy, we changed training, we changed practices, we changed use of certain less lethal tools. Like, we did everything possible to give these officers the advantage and the resources and the tools they need to be successful.
That's amazing. That's really impressive. So now that you are, now you have your own company and you're offering from Blue Theory, right? You're offering this training to other departments. Is that still available for other departments to utilize, essentially, for anybody who could be listening as trainers? How can they reach you? How can they learn more about this?
Yes, absolutely. So I do have Blue Theory. We have an impressive cadre of instructors. We're associated with the Association of Force Investigators. So we still run force analysis. We do consultation and force analysis for different departments. We're now in the process of joining with the state of Florida and one of the local universities to do a force analysis and training development unit housed in the university to service all of the state of Florida. And all the trainings that we've developed are available, and whether through consultation or going out to specific places or people coming to us. I don't have a website because I haven't had the need for one just yet. I know I will. But should I provide my email, or
Sure. Yes, and we can put it in the comments as well, but why don't you say your email?
Okay, so my email is C Gonzalez, Gonzalez, just like it's spelled on the screen here, at blue-theory.com.
Blue-theory.com. C Gonzalez. Is it C. Gonzalez or C Gonzalez?
C Gonzalez.
C Gonzalez at blue-theory.com. And we'll put that in the comments as well for anybody who wants to reach out to learn more. So we have just a couple of minutes. I don't want to take too much of your time, but I do want to ask you, just being in this role for your 30 years, essentially, what are some challenges from a leadership perspective that you see in law enforcement to innovate training? Because I know that, you and I talked about the need to innovate and the need to basically standardize this kind of new approaches and not just go with the standard. What are some challenges and what are some changes we need from a leadership perspective?
So for a challenge perspective, it's resources and fiscal capability, budgetary capability, right? You have to have the money and the resources in order to allocate them to a training like this. And depending on the size of the department, it could be pretty expensive to run a unit, to run a force analysis unit, to run a training unit that did things in the way we did, to extend the academy. It can be costly. Um, it can be done. There are ways to mitigate it. There are ways to, we have mitigated some of it in this process and trying to get it done. What I find is that academia and community have perception on the police, and that's fine. They're entitled to have perception, and police have their own perception of themselves, right? But it's not a unified perception, and a lot of the research out there doesn't involve all three. Let's call it branches, right? So you have academia running studies from their perspective on a specific thing, and they come up with a result, and then the community reads those results and think, okay, this is what we have to really go by. Not all of them, but a good portion of them have very low or little or none practitioner knowledge, police or some kind of subject matter expert involved. And we know in law enforcement that as a result, as a result, I'm going to say the word twice, the results are skewed because you're not taking certain things into consideration when doing so. So I think a big difference in order to continue this way forward or moving our way forward is to have law enforcement, all public safety, team up with academia and community and forge and develop these processes together, do the studies, do the research, explain themselves. I think police in general do a very poor job of explaining why they do things.
Yeah.
Something bad will happen, it'll go viral. The police chief or their public information officer comes on the screen and says, we can't talk about it, it's under investigation. And yes, that
They're
is
overly
accurate.
apologetic, in my opinion, sometimes, which is very not, I know it's
Right.
not popular public opinion, but
Correct.
just being in this community for a little bit now, I just think that leadership needs to be more almost protective of their own officers, I think, and also good the officers are doing, not just apologize after the bad events, which is of course apologize after mistakes, but also promote the good behavior, which is a lot more common than what public thinks. So it's a skewed perception, I think, also from that angle, because that's what the leadership is projecting.
Absolutely, 100%. So those things need to not only start to happen, but once they start, they need to continue to happen. But I do think that there are several groups in academia, several universities, including yourself, who are championing the efforts in regards to understanding what law enforcement does and how to make them better. And I think we're going to make a significant impact in the next few years in regards to law enforcement across the United States.
I think so too. I'm very hopeful. That there are lots of people that are working on great initiatives, great trainings, great research. So yeah. So on that positive note, thank you, Carlos, for being here. And it's always wonderful to talk to you. Thank you, and yeah, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, ma'am. I really appreciate it. I'm humbled by you asking me. I really respect what you do and the person you are. So have a wonderful Memorial Day weekend.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.